Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. War in remembrance, thinking about the end of the Second World War in Europe 71 years ago. Are we now replaying the Cold War? Also, how the Syria story is grossly distorted in Western media. George Orwell would be very proud. And the U.S. presidential campaign. What happens when the major candidates have such dismal negatives? Two CrossTalk stories in the media. I'm joined by my guest, Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. We also have Dmitry Babic. He is a political analyst with Sputnik International. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Dima Babic, today is Victory Day. Why is it so important to Russians? Because if we compare Victory Day yesterday in Europe, it's not really a big deal. Why is it such a big deal to this day for Russia, 71 years on?
Well, I would say, first of all, because of the losses, but now also because the events of 1939, 1941 are replaying themselves one for one under our very own eyes. I didn't expect us to celebrate it till this day. I remember how in 1995, when relations with the West seemed to be improving, my boss, the editor-in-chief of Komsomolskaya Pravda, told me that probably this is the last big celebration that we are having.
There even was a year that they didn't have a parade, wasn't there?
In 1995, we had a parade, but there was Clinton there. There were all the European leaders. There was absolutely no question about Westerners coming to the victory parade in Moscow. Even the Moscow Times, believe it or not, wrote that the role of Russia in defeating Nazism is indisputable. And now, just let me quote you what the UPI wrote. You know, UPI is an information agency. In a challenge to NATO, Russia moves troops to the border. So I think that...
I mean, think about the logic of that. Go ahead.
You know,
to its own border. To its own border. Its own border. Okay.
Exactly. And you know, one of the biggest debates right now in Russia, you know, is the series of books of this pseudo-historian, Bogdan Rizun, writing under the pen name of Viktor Suvorov, who claimed that Stalin actually planned to attack Hitler first. Okay. So I think in 20 years, if we survive a nuclear war, the future Rizun will take that article from the UPI and say, look, Russia moved troops to the border. The reality is that Russia did not move troops to the border. The defense minister Shoigu just said, we're going to create 3 divisions to fend off a possible Western attack from that
Let's go to Marcus in London. This is what's really quite amazing to me, is because, as Dima Babic pointed out, is that we're almost replaying the events of the past here, and it's the West that is sleepwalking into this conflict here.
They're not sleepwalking.
Russia, okay, we can get to that. Russia moves troops to its own border, and it's considered threatening. Go ahead, Marcus. Explain if that is explainable.
Well, it can be explained by having a look at the history. Russophobia has a very, very firm presence in the history of the West, be it when Russia was Tsarist, when Russia was communist, and even Russia today. There's a great amount of suspicion and, quite frankly, racism in the West towards Russia. But I do think when we're talking about Victory Day, the focus should be on the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War, because of course Victory Day is the most important event on the Russian calendar. It symbolises the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany, and that came at a terrible cost. 28 million Soviet people died. Of that figure, something like 18 million were civilians. And of course the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, is an unknown war in Britain and in America. And very few British people, for example, understand that it was on the Eastern Front where the Second World War was won and lost. 88% of total Wehrmacht casualties in the war were incurred on the Eastern Front. Or if I can put it another way, of every 5 German soldiers killed in the Second World War, 4 out of 5 were killed against the Russians. So that's a very, very important fact. We are here today having this discussion because of the sacrifices of the Red Army. The Red Army didn't just save the Soviet people from annihilation, they saved mankind from annihilation.
You know, Mark, one of the things is that it's not as celebrated in Europe is because, well, Europe didn't liberate itself. And this is something, again, not giving credit to the Soviet Union. We can give credit to the Allies, of course, but if it hadn't been for what we just heard from Marcus, there wouldn't have been a liberation of Nazism in Europe.
Yeah, there is a very much a political project, an attempt to rewrite the narrative of World War history, to rewrite the Soviet Union's contribution to it out. And we have to remember...
What does that do about the defeat of Nazism? I mean, are you whitewashing that as you whitewash Soviet history?
We whitewash and smear it all together by trying to falsely equate the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, with the Soviet Union, and try to smear it all together as this is just a general evil and so on. But you know, the truth of the matter is that I speak of someone who has both American and Russian ancestors who died in World War II on both the American and the Soviet sides. And America lost 300,000 people in World War II, a terrible price to pay.
And the Soviets lost more in Stalingrad.
Right, in Stalingrad. The Soviets lost 30 million. That is a cost that no Westerner can ever understand why this is such an important facet of Russian and other post-Soviet countries'
and also
identity.
Of security right here. I mean, this is one of the things that's very they see a military alliance that came into being as a result of the Cold War. The Cold War has been over for more than a quarter of a century right here. We still have this military alliance expanding eastward, and it deems Russia as a threat.
The explicit goal of NATO at its beginning, as outlined, was to keep America in Europe, to keep Germany down, and to keep Russia out of Europe.
Okay. Is that the same case right now, Dima?
Well, I think yes, but first I think we should be a little more precise with figures. You know, the official figures in Russia is 27 million. It can be more because just like Germany in the end of the war officially stated that there was just 1,500,000 soldiers, which was of course underestimated. You know, they lost a lot more. But I think with this war we're going to counter that for many more years. But I agree with you. NATO is expanding, and you know, when you object to it, they accuse you of providing fodder to Russian propaganda. Well, I can tell you that Hitler provided fodder for Russian propaganda, and that propaganda was right, because he was a person bringing Germany back to medieval times. You know, when the Western media called him a controversial nationalist leader of Germany in 1934, the Russian propaganda called him what he was, a butcher of Europe, future butcher of Europe, the murkiest kind of reactionary in Europe. So right now, when people accuse us here of propaganda, I can tell you who was closer to the truth in 1934: the Western media, which talked about controversial leaders of Italy and Germany, or the Soviet propaganda, the Russian propaganda, which called a spade at the moment.
Marcus, you know, I just mentioned here that NATO came into existence as a result of the rise of the Cold War. I guess it's pretty. I think we could all agree here that we have a new Cold War. How is it different than the other one?
Well, I don't think the Cold War as such actually ended in 1991 or 1992. I mean, certainly the ideological element did end, the confrontation between capitalism and communism. That is dead and buried. However, that traditional rivalry between great powers, that never ended. However, if you have a look what happened from 1992 onwards, Russia went into complete and utter meltdown, politically, economically, and militarily. And of course, the West, led by the United States, saw an opportunity to cement Western global hegemony, and that meant by taking in all the former countries which used to be a part of the Soviet bloc into NATO, into the European Union, and pushing eastwards towards Russia's western borders, which of course is completely against what George Bush Sr. told Mikhail Gorbachev, and of course the American Secretary of State at the time, James Baker. He's acknowledged in his memoirs that Gorbachev was told that for the Soviet Union consenting to East Germany and West Germany becoming reunified, that NATO would not expand eastwards. But of course, you know, they did, and we can say a lot about Gorbachev's naivety. But the reality is that Russian national security is threatened by NATO being on its borders. And it's not just NATO. We have the construction of an American missile defense system in Eastern Europe, which of course is aimed at the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent. It's not aimed against Iran. It's not aimed against North Korea. It's aimed against Russia. It's an intolerable situation.
This time
Russia
around,
has to defend itself.
This time around, if I'm going to Mark here, this time around, at least they admitted it's directed towards Russia. Before they said it was Iran here. One of the other things here, before we go to the break, is important here, is it how Ukraine fits into this puzzle here, because there's a blind eye being turned to fascist elements in Ukraine.
Yeah, there's an article I encourage everyone to read in Foreign Policy by Josh Cohen. It's called The Historian Whitewashing Ukraine's History. And in this article, he very clearly outlines how historians promoted to positions of reconstituting, rewriting historical memory by the Kiev regime and by their own laws in which they glorify West Ukrainian organizations, the OUN, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the Organization of Ukrainian. These were fascist groups who were genocidal Nazi collaborators who, on their own, were committed brutal massacres of hundreds of thousands of Poles, Jews, and other Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. And in the course of this article, they highlight, one, that this is very much a political project. And here he's quoting Jared McBride at the U.S.'s Kennedy's Institute and the Museum of Holocaust History. That this is a political project designed to create a completely one-sided view of Ukrainian history that only has a preference in Galicia, that is Western Ukraine.
But this is always at the expense of Russia's narrative.
It's not only at the expense of Russia's narrative, it's at the expense of the identities of people of Eastern Ukraine. And the author points out,
I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on stories in the media. Stay with our team.
Stalin was very insistent that the basic principle of the function of the United Nations had to be great power unity and great power unanimity, and this is where you get the veto system in the Security Council from. And in fact, without the veto system, of course, the UN would have collapsed.
On July 8, 2014, Israel launched a devastating military attack on the Gaza Strip. Over the course of 51 days, the Israeli military dropped nearly 20,000 tons of explosive on Gaza.
I worked in European media for a long time. The coverage is the opposite. You come to America and you think that you're an alien. You're looking at a different world or a different planet. And I'm thinking, what's going on here?
This administration will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself.
It's extremely difficult to make clear to people that it is basically a propaganda story.
Israel is under siege by a terrorist organization.
How do you make that clear when the mainstream spectacle is so unrelenting and total?
If you want to understand how the propaganda works, especially in the US, you need to read the Luntz document. What we've seen is really another kind of occupation, an occupation of American media and what we could call the American mind.
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Western media spin. Okay, Mark, I want to go back to you. You want to finish your point? We're talking about the historical narratives, particularly out of Ukraine.
Yeah, this whitewashing of Ukrainian history that Josh Cohen describes, he says, he points out two very important things. He points out, one, that this is a political project. It denies the identity and the agency of the people of South and East Ukraine. It attempts to essentially exterminate it, wipe it out from existence. This is a form of ethnic cleansing. And the other thing he points out, that you're building a modern Ukraine on what he calls a false narrative of the Holocaust. That is, you're building a country on Holocaust denial, and that's what it is. But to conclude, he points out the new laws that criticize that ban any criticism and criminalize any criticism of genocidal Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. The laws that declare them as founding fathers of the nation and national heroes. He points out that the nationalists who idealized these fascists played instrumental roles in overthrowing the previous government of Ukraine and in fighting against the people of East Ukraine. But then he concludes this by saying that all of this just provides cannon fodder for Russian propaganda that the country is overrun by fascists.
One thing I'd like to point out here, before I go to Dima Babic here, if you look at all of us on this program right here, including Marcus Papadopoulos in London, we're all wearing the St. George ribbon right here, all of us. In Ukraine, that's could be a political.
It's a crime. You either be assaulted in the streets or arrested.
Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I would like to specify a little bit that law in Ukraine which prohibits criticism. It prohibits criticism of Ukrainian insurgent army, of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. So it doesn't call them genocidal murderers, which they were. It calls them their official names, but you cannot criticize any of them. And here, Ukraine, the body which took that decision, the Institute of National Memory in Ukraine, was copied after the Polish Institute of National Memory, which just set about destroying the Soviet monuments in Poland, the monuments to Soviet soldiers, 600,000 of them.
And it was
died
at the end of the Cold War, it was
Poland.
agreed that those monuments wouldn't be touched. Okay, gentlemen, I want to move on. We talked about the export of Western values into Ukraine. Marcus, let's change gears and talk about what's going on in Syria. I said in my introduction that George Orwell would be proud. I mean, if you listen to Western media, Aleppo is under siege by the government Damascus. I mean, it's truly Orwellian how Western media is reporting the Syria story. Go ahead.
Well, the way the Western media is behaving in Syria is absolutely disgusting. It's lies, distortion, manipulation, and we have to always remember that the precedent for the way Western media is behaving in Syria, Ukraine, Libya, was in the former Yugoslavia, the wars in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. Let's not forget, in Kosovo, Western media was talking about 500,000 Kosovan Albanians murdered. A lie. In Croatia, the old town of Dubrovnik had been razed to the ground. Absolute lies. And you know, if we come back to Syria, I remember in the summer of 2012, Sky News, the Sky News website in Britain, listed two sets of categories in the Syrian conflict. One, civilians, and two, Syrian army. So to an unsuspecting reader, the conclusion was simple, that the Syrian army is slaughtering civilians. However, someone that's aware of the way Western media works would have looked at those two categories and asked themselves this question, well, who's killing the Syrian soldiers? There should have been three categories: Syrian army casualties, militant casualties, and civilian casualties. But that shows the lengths to which Western media will go.
And it got a lot worse.
Western political foreign policy.
It even got worse. If I'm going to Mark here with me, is that they call these rebel groups. They're talking about al-Nusra and other related groups to Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-like groups. They don't like to call them by their name, do they?
Yeah, they refuse to admit, and they attempt to obscure the fact that the West's proxies on the ground, and we're saying the West, Saudi Arabia's, Qatar's, are openly allied with al-Nusra, which is recognized by the UN as a branch of al-Qaeda.
Though the U.S. would like to clean up their act and give them legitimacy.
For the second time, President Obama, in negotiations with Russia, attempted to give protection to the area where al-Qaeda are, in Aleppo and elsewhere. And we've recently had a Pentagon spokesman who let slip that Aleppo is essentially the rebel portion, because it's only a small portion of Aleppo, that is owned by the rebels, is owned by al-Qaeda. And Obama again attempts to shield them because they are embedded. They are the specialized units, the PR units, the advanced American weapons unit owners of al-Qaeda. And without this larger al-Qaeda and friends jihadist forces, the West proxies are non-existent.
We've also heard from Secretary of State Kerry that August 1st, some magical reason, August 1st, there must be a political transition, which no one is agreed to that. It's only John Kerry saying this. I mean, is this essentially saying till August 1st, if nothing changes, if Assad doesn't go, there'll be regime change?
Or else.
Or else, yeah.
Well, I think if we look at the number of times when Kerry said we don't insist on Assad leaving, and the number of times when he said Assad must go, he must have some kind of a conflict disorder in his head. But this is not surprising, because I was stunned just this week by that article in The Guardian, which is headline how Britain funds the propaganda war against ISIS in Syria. So this article, I absolutely encourage everyone to read it, because it says that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Britain, actually with the Ministry of Defense behind it, overseen by the Ministry of Defense, they hire, I quote, contractors from Istanbul who would provide objective photos, videos, military reports, radio broadcasts from Syria. And then the British public is fed these reports, and Mr. Hammond says that they are independent reports showing how Russia is very bad, bombing civilians. So how do you expect contractors who get from the British government 2.4 million pounds, how do you expect them to say, Philip Hammond, you're lying?
Okay.
You know?
Well, let's go to Marcus. We had the defense secretary have a comment on the Palmyra concert that Russia performed for the Syrian people. I watched it. I hope a lot of our viewers did. It was an exquisite experience. It was a very moving experience. But the foreign secretary called it tasteless. How do you react to that?
Well, perhaps Philip Hammond should pay a visit to Palmyra and meet the civilians there and say to their faces that he thought the concert was tasteless and see what the response would be. I suspect he wouldn't go anywhere near Palmyra. I suspect he wouldn't go anywhere near Damascus or Aleppo or Tartus, because he would know the sheer amount of bitterness and hostility felt by ordinary Syrian people towards Britain and towards America and towards France. But I would also add that that comment by Philip Hammond, to me, reflects a bitterness within London, but also Washington, a bitterness that the Russian military campaign has been exceptionally successful, that it has proved to be a turning point in the war, and that the West, what they did in the former Yugoslavia, what they did in Iraq, will never be able to happen again, because Russia in 2016 is a strong country, and Russia will not allow NATO military intervention in Syria, the likes of which we saw in Bosnia, in Kosovo, Afghanistan and Iraq. So yes, while Philip Hammond's comments were utterly tasteless, I think we should look at them and take some sort of satisfaction that we know the Russian military campaign has changed things in Syria, and that the Syrian government, in my opinion, in the long term, it's going to prevail.
It's almost as if the last tool in the toolbox is to say classical music is tasteless here. Gentlemen, we have to talk about the U.S. presidential election here. Mark Sloboda, I can't remember in my lifetime when we have two presumptive candidates for the major parties that have such strong negatives. How is this going to play out with the electorate over the next few months?
Well, I think that these, the electorate, the candidates that have been elected are actually in a bit of agreement here, because I've seen research that shows, polling, that the majority of the candidates supporting either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton are taking that position. primarily, their primary motivation is opposing the other candidate from taking office. So this is
so it's a double negative.
It's not just a choice of the lesser of two evils. It's the mother of all lesser of two evil choices in this case. And you know, we've seen the Republican Party when the national chairman of the party finally waved the flag of surrender and recognized that Donald Trump is going to be their nominee.
But there's still a lot of Dima Babic here, if I can and go to you. Again, you know, we have this is in many ways this is an insurgency happening in American politics. I mean, Hillary Clinton hasn't clinched it. Bernie Sanders is still giving a good fight here, but the question will be, will the Bernie Sanders people support Hillary? And what we could see for the first time in maybe in a long time, historically speaking, I'm not sure if it's ever happened, we'll see a transmigration of people leaving parties going to the other. Go ahead.
Well, I hope that Bernie Sanders supporters won't support Hillary, because I agree with the headline of Ben Norton's article on Savon. Democrats, this is why you need to fear Hillary Clinton. And in that article, Ben Norton proves that actually Hillary Clinton is a lot more belligerent than any other candidate in this campaign.
Okay, that's a view.
Her role in Libya, her role
exactly
in Syria,
here. That's a view from the outside. Marcus Papadopoulos, I can go to you. London, give you the last word here. Another outsider looking into the American campaign. Go ahead.
Can I say something very different?
Go ahead.
In my opinion, it doesn't matter who sits in the White House. It doesn't matter if it's Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, or Donald Trump. The reality is that they will still pursue Western American foreign policy in the context of military intervention around the world. Donald Trump says he's against the military intervention. The reality is that when you come into the White House, the machines of the American government, they come around you and they dictate to you what to do. So if Donald Trump becomes president, America will still be insisting on intervening in other countries' affairs, and if Hillary Clinton becomes president, it will be the same, and Bernie Sanders will become the same. That's a very, very sad reality, but it's a reality.
Well, Marcus, this is how I ended last week's program. Whoever wins will give us plenty of material on this program here. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
It will not